I'm Cynthia Jackson-Elmoore, Dean of the Honors College here at Michigan State University, and I'd like to also introduce floating in the room, at least acknowledge, are my colleagues John Beck, who is the professor who organizes the series for us, and Stephanie Cpak, who is the communications manager for the Honors College and helps with all of the logistics. Can you not hear me very well?
No, you're good.
And also, I want to acknowledge that we have the MSU Alumni Association. They manage the live stream for us, and so I am going to ask that if you do have a cell phone, if you could put it on vibrate or silent, something that won't just be disruptive to those listening to us online, and also the Honors College Facebook page. We continue to be proud to sponsor Sharper Focus Wider Lens. It is an opportunity for us to highlight the great work happening here on campus and to engage with our broader community. And it's our pleasure that it continues to serve a purpose, not just here on campus, but for the broader community and those that join us via the live stream. Tonight, we're going to explore notions of healing. We're not going to learn about any specific type of healing for a specific situation. It's really about across the spectrum of healing, what are different things that we should consider. And to remind those who are with us again and make those who are joining us for the first time aware, we do not walk away with all of the questions answered. In fact, we usually raise more questions and leave you wanting more, having additional things that you want to know about. We hope to start the dialogue. We hope to encourage you to have conversations with our panelists and with each other. And so tonight I would like to introduce our panelists, and I am introducing them in the order that they will speak. To my far right is Heather Howard, an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology with affiliations to the American Indian and Indigenous Studies Program and the Native American Institute. Howard's research interests are the politics of knowledge production in cultural, heritage, health, and social service delivery organizations, community-driven methodologies, medical anthropology, Indigenous peoples' health and technologies of chronic illness management. Indigenous people and urbanization is a central focus of her research, in which she examines the evolution of urban indigenous epistemologies of community, including authority-making structures and the production of knowledge itself as a dynamic process which intervenes in the production of politics, ethical practice, and the social order. Howard earned her doctorate from the University of University of Toronto. Just a small difference there. To her immediate left is Mary Bedikian. She is a professor of law in residence and director of the Alternative Dispute Resolution Program in the College of Law. Bedikian is the former district vice president of the Detroit region of American Arbitration Association, where she worked for 28 years. Her extensive experience in alternative dispute resolution spans many sectors, including labor, commercial, construction, international, and employment. In 1987, Bedikian created one of the first interactive alternative dispute resolution courses in the state of Michigan. Bedikian earned her Juris Doctorate from Michigan State University. In the middle, we have William Chopik, an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology. Chopik is a social personality psychologist interested in how relationships and the people in them change over time. His research focuses on how factors both inside, such as biological and hormonal, and outside, such as social roles and geography, of people influence their approach to social relationships. His work examines phenomena as broad as how relationships and social institutions shape development, and as focused as the hormonal mechanisms that underlie love and intimacy. Chopik earned his doctorate from the University of Michigan. To his left is Clare, an assistant professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine. Luz is a gerontologist who has conducted research on health services delivery for older adults, optimal functional ability and quality of life, and the intersection of the arts and health. She is founding director of Age Alive, a program to foster age-related networking, information exchange, and partnerships across Michigan State University. Prior to MSU, she worked for 20 years as a geriatric social worker and a consultant in long-term care settings. Luz earned her doctorate from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. And to my immediate right, we have Scott Becker, who is a mental health advisor in residence education and housing services. He is also a licensed psychologist in private practice here in Okemos, Michigan. Well, we're in East Lansing, but right down the street in Okemos. He said the greater Lansing area. Just a little plug for your business. Over the past 24 years, he has worked at several universities as a staff psychologist, faculty member, director of training, and most recently as a director of MSU Counseling Center. He is currently writing a book on the combined impact of globalization, climate change, digital technology, and political propaganda, entitled Facing Monsters. Becker earned his doctorate from Miami University. On tonight, they will touch on a wide range of topics, and it is not their job to make sense of each other's topics. And so we want you to know that they're just going to present from their experience and their background. And to the degree that I'm able, I will be charged with the sense making at the end. And with no further ado, I'd like to release you into the hands of Heather.
Green light's supposed to come on. Is it on? Yep. There's no green light. Okay, so I have a slight change to the title you might have seen advertised because I'm going to raise some ideas about varieties of healing that have to do with the conceptualization and practice of reconciliation. Specifically, my reflections emerge from my research with Indigenous peoples and the historification processes of health and social services, which is a process I examine in which the past comes to bear in a variety of ways on the explanatory frames of disease in the present and the aspirations for disease prevention and eradication in the future. I am not an Indigenous person myself, but I'm a member of Anishinaabe and Dakota families through marriage. I was born in a part of the territory of the Abenaki known as Quebec and have lived in the lands of the Anishinaabe for most of my life, also known as Ontario, Canada, and Michigan, all Indigenous place names, by the way. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples, and those national, state, and provincial boundaries transect their ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands, which include those occupied by Michigan State University, seated in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. This Indigenous land acknowledgement represents an increasing practice by settler institutions that emulates a long-standing practice by Indigenous peoples to recognize the relational responsibilities of care and sovereignty of Indigenous nations to the land where one is located. However, in the recent translation to settler discourse, land acknowledgements are largely shaped by the evolution of reconciliation processes. And in particular, I'm going to focus my comments tonight on these developments in Canada with examples from my research in Toronto. Indeed, the City of Toronto provides an explanation for its own land acknowledgement in the following terms. Quote, "A land acknowledgement gives time for reflection and demonstrates recognition of Indigenous lands, treaties, and peoples. It involves thinking about what happened in the past and what changes can be made going forward in order to further the reconciliation process. They mark a small and important step in the process of reconciliation and building a positive relationship with Indigenous peoples. They make an opportunity to take part in an act of reconciliation and recognize the enduring presence and resilience of Indigenous peoples. They are also a reminder that we are all accountable to these relationships." End of quote. So you can see some themes emerging here already that might be characterized as healing relationships. These themes include reflection, recognition, honoring, participation, accountability on the part of non-Indigenous people. And while treaties, which are nation-to-nation agreements, are mentioned, Indigenous peoples are represented as enduring, present, and resilient, but their sovereignty is kind of backgrounded. And this hints at some of the ways that official Truth and Reconciliation Commission struck in Canada in 2008 and which concluded in 2015 has been fraught with some tensions and challenges. This TRC resulted specifically from the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, and it was primarily charged with documenting the lasting impacts of the residential school system on those who attended and their families, and I'll explain more about that in a second. The TRC is also one commission in a long string of commissions and other special reporting projects that have been struck to study Indigenous peoples in Canada for more than a century. Most notably, perhaps, was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996 that was criticized for writing up again what Indigenous people already know and about making obsolete recommendations. However, it also brought to the fore the policy of systemic, mostly forced removal of Indigenous children to residential schools and began the documentation of the very widespread physical and sexual abuse that took place in those schools. These schools were operated by various denominations of Christian churches and paid by the Canadian government from the latter part of the 19th century until nearly the close of the 20th century, and it was part of this systemic aggressive assimilation policy. So there are many people who are survivors of the schools living today, and their experience is largely understood as a traumatic one that has impacted their families and subsequent generations. After the Royal Commission report, an Aboriginal Healing Foundation was established to, quote, foster sustainable healing strategies in Indigenous communities to address the impacts of the residential school system. And that continued alongside the TRC until 2014. So themes emerging from this legacy for healing and reconciliation involve documenting, substantiating, legitimizing truth from the perspective of Indigenous peoples about abuse, suffering, death, and cultural destruction experienced by individuals because of their collective identity, and rippling to families and communities across generations. Likewise, this ripple effect draws in all non-Indigenous peoples to take up responsibility for repairing and healing the perpetrations committed by the institutions of settler society. And interpretations of how this responsibility can be taken up has drawn some criticism. For example, merely acknowledging the wrongdoing of others in the past, trying to close a, quote, sad chapter in Canadian history, forecloses recognition of ongoing benefits of the suffering of Indigenous peoples that maintain settler colonial society. In my research, I'm interested in the connections made between these structures of oppression and disease, and have paid particular attention to diabetes. This is because diabetes was largely unknown among Indigenous people until the mid-20th century, but now Indigenous people's rates of diabetes are 3 to 6 times higher than the mainstream population. It has been described as a disease of colonization, in that colonization generated the conditions for the high prevalence of type 2 diabetes. And I've examined in my research the structuring violence of residential school food socialization and diabetes as a disease of colonization, and increasingly the perspective that the legacy of colonization in residential schools and their ongoing effects should be considered in Indigenous people's health care. For Indigenous peoples, cultural traditions are the pathway to healing diabetes. As I have a kind of a busy slide here, but basically this is a picture of an event called Drumming for Diabetes that took place in Toronto, and which was later commented on by one of the organizers as a means to heal through song, a call upon ancestors in the spirit world to help fight the diabetes epidemic. And finally, after all these commissions and studies, how might we go about conducting research that is in itself healing? Is there such a thing as healing research? So another thing I'm looking at in my research is examining residential school and diabetes, or I'm sorry, in the project that looked at the residential school and diabetes, we focused on both the regimented and disciplinary relationships with food, including the association between power, punishment, morality, and food, and the legacy of deprivation. But we also looked at the possibilities for reclaiming food traditions and the use of social memory to shift survivors' identification with victimhood to one of resilience. And in this last image that's on the right, which is a picture of a quilt and is meant to segue to one of the speakers further down the line here, is by one of our research participants in another project I did in which participants could express their experience of living with diabetes through art projects. And it highlights some possibilities for healing research in that it anticipates an application of change in the lives of individuals and in the community. But research can also be a healing event when it reflects the principles of responsibility, relevance, respect, and reciprocity, as well as enact a transformation in the personhood of researchers, even as this engagement with reconciliation is healing, and healing as reconciliation is very complicated. I'll stop there.
Is it on?
Yes, you may
Is
want
it?
to pull it closer to yourself.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay, thank you. In 1995, Patrick Wall was a retired Marine Corps former member, and it was time for him to party. He had just recently divorced. He was done with the Marine Corps, and he hooked up with his buddies and proceeded to get drunk. After a period of lying comatose, he regained consciousness, and his buddies helped him get drunk again. And so, long story short, he got into his pickup truck in his inebriated state, and he killed a young woman. When the mother saw her daughter, she was horrified. And that pain, that anguish from that evening has resonated with her every single day forward. Enter restorative justice. What is it? How does it work? And how does it provide the bases for healing and transformation that Heather talked about a few moments ago? The mother in this case was so anguished that she wanted to see Patrick Walls put behind bars. And he was. He was found guilty on 3 counts of manslaughter, and he was basically holed up for a decade. And each time he came up for parole, she was insistent that he stay behind bars. But one day, she had a slight change of heart, and she said, I want to know if he feels anything from that evening. And so a meeting was set up between the two of them. And he admitted that he was in the same degree of pain that she was, and that if she allowed him to be paroled, that he would spend the rest of his life telling young people, or anyone for that matter, who proceeded to drink and get behind the wheel not to do so. So what are the underlying principles, values, and procedural safeguards of restorative justice? In the case that I just mentioned to you, bringing 2 parties together, or a multiplicity of parties, takes more than will. But each party has to be willing to come to the table and not be coerced in doing so. So one of the key underlying principles here is voluntary and informed consent. The second principle is that the victim and the offender both have to accept that the offense has in fact been committed. So in our case, Patrick Walls could not abdicate his responsibility for what transpired. And he has to accept the responsibility for that offense. The third is that the facts have to provide sufficient evidence to proceed with a charge. So in the event that these 2 people could not come together and speak their mind to each other and transform and heal in the process, that the system, if you will, would move forward with prosecuting, as they did with Patrick eventually, but that they would move forward with charging him. One of the beauties of the victim offender mediation / restorative justice process is that referrals can occur at any stage of the criminal system, so that even if you're in a pre-charge diversion element, at that point can trigger the meeting of the minds, or even afterwards during post-sentencing. There is no ideal time for which this kind of meeting can occur. It's beneficial at any point in the process. And then finally, one of the other triggering principles for this kind of process to work is that the programs have to protect the work product of the participants as well as the communications that abide within it. So if, for example, we were to have a mediator intervene in this kind of dialogue, it would be critically important to have all the communications within that system remain confidential, that the communications could not later be used to facilitate discovery in a court process, could not be used to endanger any of the participants, and could not be used to press additional kinds of charges in the event that there was an apology given or that there was some kind of extraordinary remorse that was actually communicated. So why does this process work more than it fails? And I'm going to speak for a moment about why it works and then also some of the compromises of the process. The victim-offender mediation process works because it opens up an opportunity for dialogue for people that have been harmed, for people that have been hurt. And it promotes both victim healing and what we call offender accountability. So in our case, Patrick Walls was really being held accountable when he met with the mother of the woman he actually killed. Victim-offender mediation also takes into account the very unique emotional aspect that is part of a criminal act. And in this way, I don't know how many of you have ever participated in a mediation, but you're all part of a community, and it's possible that you may have been involved in some kind of intervention with a neutral where a dispute was resolved short of taking the matter to court. And the unique part about victim-offender mediation programs is that it does take into account the emotions that people are feeling. What's the impact? What was the impact when the mother saw her daughter in this catastrophic state? And what was the impact when Patrick Walls gained consciousness? Because he passed out, obviously, in his pickup truck at 90 miles an hour. But once he regained consciousness, what was the impact on him when he was told what he had done, what his acts were? And then finally, victim-offender mediators will tend to use a humanistic model that facilitates dialogue and mutual aid. These are trained mediators. These are individuals who really understand how to work with the human side of the dispute. When you're in court, you don't get the human side of the dispute generally. You get the facts, the cold, hard facts. But here, when you're dealing in a mediatory kind of arrangement, in a facilitative kind of arrangement, the third-party neutral is very skilled, very agile, very adept at getting out the emotional facets of the dispute. Now, what are some of the disadvantages of restorative justice and victim-offender mediation? There have been known to be breaches of confidentiality. I mean, we can obviously press upon the participants. We can have them sign documents that everything is going to be kept confidential. That's not always been the case. And especially when we're dealing with cases like rape and sexual assault, which have tremendous impact in the community, those breaches have occurred. The second disadvantage of restorative justice is the inability to prevent recidivism. I mean, theoretically, when you think about it, bringing two people together or a multiple group of people together should, if they're willing to engage in the dialogue necessary to push past the events, they should be able to, in fact, not have a recurrence, but that's not been the case. And then finally, and this is something that I personally have seen, there is oftentimes a compromise of the neutrality of the mediator. And we have seen this primarily in restorative justice programs that have been employed either in the workplace or in institutional settings like Michigan State University or other universities, where the mediator is sort of the hired gun by the institution that wants to use that system. And so for a mediator to really be neutral and dispassionate, the mediator has to be totally engaged and not receive compensation from one of the parties in the actual matter or a party that wants to see justice done. And especially if the role of the mediator is to simply enforce certain procedural rules that have been set up by that particular entity. I want to just give you one primary conclusion that, notwithstanding some of these disadvantages that I've mentioned, restorative justice heals. It is a process that, if properly structured, will repair and foster a sense of positive movement within a community. And I have been witness to that for the last 3 decades of my life. Thank you.
Thanks. I think I might have some slides here. Oh, that'd be great. That'd be awesome. It's here. Great. Well, thanks for having me be part of such a great event. I'm a relationship researcher. I study how people fall in love for the first time, why they stay in love, why they don't. And naturally, today I'll be talking about politics and kind of how that interferes with some of those processes. So like I said, I study relationships and how wonderful they are and all the benefits that they provide us. They fill our cups, they enrich our lives. A lot of my research is dedicated to how they can be good for your health. So why do they help us live longer? Why do they convince us to go to the doctor? They make us feel better, they reduce stress. But throughout your lives, you've probably also experienced that relationships can be really wonderful, but they can also be the source of a lot of pain and suffering. And some of the greatest stresses in our life actually come from other people. So Sartre didn't really mean this in particular when he wrote this quote, but if you've ever been a party to an online discussion, whether it be Twitter or Facebook, you start to see sort of the darker side of human nature, especially when they start to disagree about things. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a study that me and a few colleagues did, looking at how living among people who are dissimilar to you affects your relationships in general. So there's been a few different studies on this. So in one particular study, they looked at over 1 million people, and they linked it to congressional voting records, and they just basically asked, how liberal to conservative are you? And then they said, do you tend to live in, say, a liberal or conservative district? And basically, if you lived among people who weren't like you, you were more likely to move away from that area over a 4-year period. And it's tied to your sense of belonging. So basically, when you're around a bunch of people who you disagree with, you feel like you don't belong there, and you disagree with them. And it sort of speaks to your core sense of who you are and how you navigate your life. And this is one of the reasons it's hypothesized why people are ideologically segregating. So basically, why there are pockets of conservatives and liberals throughout the country. So one typical finding that is proposed is that there are fewer and fewer competitive districts in the United States. So if you look at if people get reelected, they're actually reelected at really high rates. And part of that is because people live among really similar others. There's liberal towns, there's conservative towns, there's sort of basically a homogenous group of people living together. Of course, people have also tried to exploit the differences that we have. So this is a Canadian company who started a dating website shortly before the 2016 election, suggesting that if liberals are unhappy with the outcome, they can move to Canada and find the one they truly love, the liberal that can really speak to them. So it's called Maple Match. The tagline is "Make Dating Great Again." I checked it today, and they're still in business. I don't know how successful they are, but here's just one example in which a lot of the differences drive all sorts of things that we do in terms of who we meet, how we feel comfortable in our environments. So I'll tell you a little bit about a study that we did. We were interested in the question of, does living among dissimilar people affect how you approach relationships in general? There's a bunch of reasons why that would happen. A lot of it has to do with your social environment, the interactions you have on a daily basis. Do you get into a lot of arguments? Do you feel like you belong? Part of it has to do with the ways in which, or the places in which you're born. Does that affect your life trajectory? Kind of the things, your hopes and dreams for where you end up someday. So there's a lot of reasons to expect why the people around you might affect how you view life and relationships in general. So we drew on data from two online surveys of participants. One had about 13,000 people. The other had about 7,000 people. And we asked a bunch of questions about their relationships. So we asked about their ability to empathize with other people. So this is, do you feel bad when you see someone suffering? And can you basically take someone's perspective that's not your own? And then we also asked about something called attachment orientation, which is basically, can you form emotional bonds with people? Do you feel comfortable opening up to people? Are you anxious when the people you like aren't around? And like in previous studies, we actually, people provided freely where they lived. So basically, we linked their zip codes to broader voting districts. So we actually knew if they were liberal or conservative, and then if they tended to reside in really Republican or Democratic districts. So basically, we looked at if you fit with your district. And I'll only show you the results for perspective taking. So this is if you're willing to take someone's perspective. And this is sort of a complicated graph, but I circled all the parts that you should pay attention to. The red circles are among those individuals who live in dissimilar areas. And what this graph in particular shows is that if you're a misfit, so basically if you're a liberal living in a Republican district or a conservative living in a liberal district, you have a greater difficulty taking other people's perspectives. And that's not just the perspectives of people you disagree with, that's also people you like. And this is also extended to the extent to which you can form bonds with people. So people find it difficult to form meaningful relationships when they're in these sort of ideologically different environments as well. So people have asked the question, there have been several studies that found that when you find yourself in this situation, it predicts you moving away to that area, whether that be a consistent place within the same state you live, across a different state line, or even a different country. And this is sort of the major debate that we have right now, is that we have a lot of disagreements with people, and yet sort of compromise is ultimately things that the country is built on and has to solve a lot of our problems. So in one sense, moving and blocking people out on social media, there's actually benefits to that. You feel immediately better. So in a way, when you sort of siphon out of those opinions, it looks like at least those people are happier. But the question is, what are the exact costs that you incur when you deliberately choose not to listen to people who disagree with you? And I'm sure you can all appreciate that there are some costs with that, sort of only listening to people that agree with you. This is especially unfortunate because there's also a lot of research showing that the people around us can confer a lot of benefits. So this in particular is a geographic map of 181 million tweets, and it's people tweeting about positive relationships. So the more red a particular county is, the more positive relationships there are. So Lansing is more of the orange area, which is pretty good. The white districts are places we don't have data for. But Michigan overall is pretty red, which is generally a good thing. So like I said, relationships can provide us a lot of different benefits. But here's this additional thing that's happening where people are specifically choosing environments that have people that they only agree with. So you see this bias across a lot of different studies. So there's one study where we said, we'll literally pay you money if you listen to an opinion that's different than you. And people said no. Just really simple, like here's a few 8 sentences of something that you disagree with, and they turned it down. They said, rate how painful it would be to listen to a differing perspective of your own on this, say, 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is dental pain and 8 is, say, like a nice walk. And it's just a few points short of dental pain in listening to someone that you disagree with, according to this particular study. But ultimately, like I said, this is sort of something that researchers are actively dealing with. And maybe during the Q&A, I can tell you about some of the solutions that psychologists have come up with, how we can break down these barriers, how you can sort of live in harmony among people you even disagree with. Because ultimately, that's the goal if you want to sort of heal across lines and find ways in which we can agree and live together. So thank you very much.
Yes, please. Could you get my thing up?
Can you hear me? Yes. All right, good. Nothing's happening.
It's starting to
We're working on it.
It's taking its time.
gives us a breather.
Yes. This doesn't count towards my 8 minutes.
No, it doesn't.
If you'd like me to move over.
It's fine, it's fine. Are we up, or?
There.
There you go.
All right, good, all right. So, I am a gerontologist, and most of my research over the last 25 years has been on the elder care workforce, particularly the direct care workers or the personal care assistants, or PCAs, as I'm going to call them for the rest of this session, who provide the hands-on personal care in people's homes and allows them to stay at home as long as possible at a lower cost and a higher quality of life. I'm going to talk about PCAs as healers, and this is set in the context of an aging world. Now, most people understand, I think, that the world is aging. Michigan is aging. I don't think most people really understand how fast it is aging, and this graph kind of says it all, right? It's aging really fast, and we know the stats, and by 2030, approximately a quarter of this population is going to be age 65 plus, and the fastest growing segment within this population are people age 85 and plus. These are statistics that are going to affect every one of us personally and collectively. It will affect our economy, transportation, housing, businesses, pretty much every sector of our world. And for the students in the audience, you can be sure that whatever discipline you are studying, you are going to be entering an aging world post-graduation and will need to know something about this. This major demographic shift means that we are going to have a higher prevalence of long-term care chronic conditions, a shift towards home care, which is where people want to live, and an increased need for long-term care supports and services. Now, the bulk of care is still provided by family members. About 80% of care, home care, is provided by family members, mostly daughters and daughter-in-laws, although this is shifting a little bit. But families need help, partly because of this demographic shift, and when they need help, they turn to paid help. And 80% of the paid help is provided by PCAs. So the problem we have right now is there is a critical shortage of PCAs. So how critical is this shortage? It is anticipated in Michigan alone, we are going to need 32,000 more PCAs by 2020, which happens to be about, 8 months away. So this is impossible, right? There's no way we're going to get 32,000 more aides. But we need to grow and stabilize this force quickly. We don't want just warm bodies, right? We want people who know what they're doing. We want people who are kind, who will give care in a respectful way that honors your choices and your wishes. And it's important for you to know that they hold a very pivotal position. They are in make or break, life or death situations. They're in the home alone, making decisions, and a qualified PCA can actually avert a really costly life-changing event like a fall or an ER visit or a hospitalization. I have done a lot of interviews with PCAs over the years, and when asked what would happen if you weren't there, and the majority of them say, well, most of my clients would either go to a nursing home or they would die. This is a fact, and it is why we need to pay attention to this workforce and understand why there's a shortage and how we can fix it. So why is there a shortage? Well, there are really no surprises on this list, I don't think. The average wage for very, very difficult work is $10 an hour. There are few, if any, benefits. It's characterized by part-time hours that are not guaranteed. We as a society, we're an ageist society. We don't place a lot of value on older adults, let alone the people that take care of them, so they are often treated with disrespect. There are no federal competency requirements, and there's a lack of awareness, partly because they work in the privacy of people's homes. So it's out of sight, out of mind, and this invisibility means that most of us don't know who they are, what they do, or why their work is important. So who are these people? Well, on paper, I can tell you what the demographics are, and these are not a surprise either. They're mostly female, middle-aged, disproportionately African American, 35% uninsured, half at in a household at 200% of the poverty level, half on public benefits. But those are the stats. Who are they really in real life? So you're going to see some photographs of some real PCAs, and I want to point out that the photographs were taken by a man named Khalid Ibrahim, who's an epidemiologist on campus, but he's also a very gifted photographer, and he and I had the great adventure traveling around the state of Michigan. I received a fellowship from the Library of Congress to interview 30 personal care workers across the state and do in-depth stories and get their photographs and find out who they are and what their work and their lives are like. This next slide, these are 4 of the workers, well, 5 of the workers that we interviewed, and I wish I had time to tell you a little bit about each one of these, but sadly I don't. Maybe during the QA I can tell a little bit more. But I will let you know that one of the outcomes of this project is a traveling exhibit, and there is a pre-show on Wednesday night at the Broad Art Lab that you are all invited to. And it is actually an opportunity for you to be a curator and tell us how we can make this exhibit more powerful. We want to use it to raise public awareness and educate policymakers. So, in their own words, when you ask them, well, what do you do for a living? They might tell you, oh, I go into people's homes, or, you know, I help with a bath, or I sit and provide relationship, companionship, and which, by the way, you know, loneliness is lethal. So, but these statements do not begin to tell the whole story. When they say, I go into people's homes, it doesn't begin to tell you that it might be $1 million home on Lake St. Clair, or it might be a drug-ridden, gang-infested neighborhood in Detroit. When they get out of the car, they hear and see bullets flying, and they calmly get back in their car, drive around the block a few times, and come back because their clients need them. If they say, oh, I just help them with a shower, it doesn't begin to tell you that the person that they're caring for might be 3 times their size, might be incontinent, might have dementia, and hey, the wheelchair doesn't fit in the shower, so you have to get in the shower with them. So you have to dig deeper to really know what is happening. On the screen, there is a list of skills that are required, and the technical skills, of course, are there. How do you lift? How do you transfer? How do you bathe? All of that. But, thank you, but I just want to say a word about this because you can read that slide, but it is really important, I think, that we stop saying that this is non-skilled, unskilled, low-skilled work. It is anything but, and that language doesn't belong anywhere. So a little bit about the attributes of the job. It is a job that is marked by being on the road, juggling clients, hours, work, family, negotiating family dynamics, facing starkly diverse settings, and dealing with difficult situations. They cannot make it on PCA work alone. Most of them rely on other household income. It can be dangerous. Almost all of them said that they had been hit, spit at, all kinds of things. Almost all of the women had dealt with sexually inappropriate advances. Everyone agreed it's based on relationships. You have to build that trust. And the majority talked about how this is what they find rewarding, but it also can be very heartbreaking, especially if a client dies or moves on. Training is essential. So why, with poor labor conditions, little respect, and really demanding, sometimes dirty work, do they keep doing it? Well, they understand how critical it is to the well-being and lives of the people they're caring for. Most of them say it's a calling, it's a desire to help people, but more than that, it's a vocational interest. They want to be in healthcare, they want to work directly with people, and they feel they have some gifts and skills that they can apply in a meaningful way, which is something I think we all want to do. It provides entree into healthcare with minimal credentials, and it meets some of their needs for flexible schedules, diversity, and autonomy. It is never boring. So, what do we do about it?
I don't know.
How do we?
I'm sorry.
How do we help the healers? And this is my last slide. Again, no surprises. Have to increase the wages and benefits, get them training, get them support. I am the director of an organization called Impart Alliance. Our whole goal is to build and support this workforce. We have compiled a list of at least a dozen concrete solutions. The problem is these are hard solutions, and they're going to require political will, fiscal commitment, mobilizing all partners. But I'm happy to say it can be done. We are getting some traction now, I think because the boomers are getting older. But I'll leave you with a quote from one of the people we interviewed, and her name is Therese Mukarashima from Lansing, Michigan. She immigrated from Rwanda in 2004 after the Civil War. She was a nurse there, could not get a nursing job here. She found PCA work and fell into it. And when I asked her, what would she like to say to the politicians? She said, even with egregious discrimination and racism, she says, ask your country to have love. We have to live like family in this country. Why do I have to go from the house to the house? Because I want to help. I need to help. They can come help me like I help them, and we can work together, and your country will be paradise. Thank you.
I think it's on? Okay. I'm really inspired by everything I've been hearing. How about you? Yeah. So mine is more global, literally and figuratively, than some of these talks. But the thread that I want to draw out from what everyone has said so far is the power of connection and belonging, and that includes our relationship to our elders and our ancestors. And to that list I would add, and our neighbors, of course, but also our sense of place. Belonging is about also literally where we're placed. And we're not really in a culture these days that thinks about that honors that we are literally and figuratively grounded in this place where we are. On the planet here in Michigan, in mid-Michigan, where there used to be two trails that crossed, and a lot of dialogue happened here in mid-Michigan before the colonial folks got here. So what we're gonna do is cover about 12,000 years of human history, talk about the consequences of that for the planet and for ourselves, for culture, for the economy, for especially relationship and identity. So I'm going to bring the perspective from eco-psychology, and I'll help define that as we go along. But the point here is psychology as a discipline has been focused on people, has been focused on human relationships, and we're going to expand that to include our relationship to the planet. We used to, for about maybe 90% of human history, have a relationship with the planet. The planet was our mother or our grandmother. It was where we are from. It was where we belonged. And she was in a reciprocal relationship with us, right? So about 12,000 years ago, we started farming. After that, we started to form cities. And at a certain point, few hundred years ago, we started industry. And at each step, you can see the other ones on here, I think, but includes chemical production, nuclear power, space travel, genetic engineering or biotechnology, and now digital technology. And where that's headed is something that futurists are calling technosapiens, which is a hybrid of humans and digital technology. Implants, uploading consciousness to grids, things like that. That's what we're looking at. So the question is, are we in a narrative of progress? And that is the main Western narrative. It's based on a lot of things. It's based on some ideas in classical Greece and the Judeo-Christian tradition, and especially the Enlightenment. But over time, it's become, I'm calling it here, conflated with political power, capitalism, and globalization. So this talk is a critique of that process of progress that disconnects us from our sense of place, our identity as communal, as grounded, embedded, right? And so over the last several decades, we've realized that all this progress has come at the expense of climate change, destruction of ecosystems, loss of biodiversity, extinction of 3% of all animals, all wild animals, and half of all the plants, and the good possibility of mass extinction. So terrifying things. And what I also want to address here is the terror that I think some of us feel when we face the facts. So I had a list, I'm not going to give it to you, but I had a slide of headlines on climate change. And the more you read, the more grim it feels and seems. So ultimately, the question here is, can we reestablish a relationship with the natural world? And is it too late? Or is it something we just need to do, right? So the question is, where are we going? What is the outcome here? And I've listed, this is not an exhaustive list, but I'm going to give you several headlines, several ideas about where we might be going. So the first would be escape. There are fantasies of going to other planets in case we mess this one up. Elon Musk is launching to Mars, for example. The related fantasy is return. We will leave and we will come back when things are better again. Escape could also be living in orbiting space stations. If you've seen any science fiction lately, there was a film called Elysium, and it had the elite living, floating above us in satellites while the rest of us were suffering down here on the ground. The other possibility is extinction, not just for animal species, but for a good portion of the human population at a certain point. So these are overwhelming ideas, right? The fourth possibility, and this recalls part of your talk, reconciliation with each other, with all the divisions that exist these days politically, but also with the planet. How do we reconcile with her as we used to imagine her? So these are some of the, what I would call, psychological consequences of separation. As a psychologist, we usually think of these in terms of human cause and human effect. But our estrangement from the environment has lowered our mind-body connection. We're not as aware of our physicality. We lose our sense of natural cycles, so we don't sleep when we should. We don't sleep when the sun sets and when the sun rises. We're on artificial clocks, and we're on mechanized clocks. In terms of technology, there is evidence showing a loss of empathy and compassion, a loss of cognitive focus, attention, memory, learning, a loss of identity, purpose, and belonging. And so if we look at all this together, what we have is estrangement from our bodies, from our minds, from our emotions, from our communities, from the natural world, and also from the planet and the cosmos. There are people who feel isolated, and as you said so beautifully, loneliness is lethal. And I would say, in terms of this larger disconnection, that is really the consequence. There's loneliness, there's longing for something we used to have for, again, about 90% of human history. So escape, this is an actual slide, an actual photoshopped image of what it might look like to take off and leave the planet. This is from Elon Musk. Return might look like this. Has anyone seen the children's film WALL-E? So WALL-E is a film for everybody, right? They're young kids who now have this image of we've destroyed the planet, we have to leave on a spaceship and wait for the planet to recover while the little robot tries to pile up the garbage that we've created. But this is the image of return. There's a plant that grows, and all it takes is one plant to trigger the alarm that the planet might be resetting so we can go back. So this is an image from the film of coming back after healing. There is no image of the sixth. This would be the sixth mass extinction event. There have been 5 according to archaeologists, geologists. This would be the 6th one if we bring it about. And there are estimates of culling the human population from several billion down to about 500 million people. That nobody knows what this would look like, but my point is it's terrifying and overwhelming, and so we tend to turn away, we tend to shut down, right? This is one summary. I won't give you all the facts, but the idea is hothouse Earth. So this is a description of what will happen. Have we already created a series of cascading events that will lead to an uninhabitable planet? So in the face of all this, we have, I'm going to skip this because there's not as much time, but the point here would be there was a 1995 report from the UN looking at human development and globalization. What they decided was the sum total of the growth that's been happening, the economic growth that's been happening, is that it is meaningless. Because it disenfranchises people, it's not sustainable, it does not create jobs, it ignores local traditions and cultures. It's meaningless growth. Okay. That's a summary of that. So in response to this, psychology has expanded its identity to include the question of environmental repair. What can we do to fix this? So James Hillman is a clinical psychologist, a depth psychologist, mainly focused on psychotherapy, but he's saying the only important question for psychology now is whether we can play a role in this healing process. That's the most important question for psychology now, is can we help fix this? There is a difference between environmental psychology and eco-psychology. Environmental psychology is more research-based. It's more looking at the cognitive elements of climate denial. We won't focus too much on that, but there are many different aspects of that are being looked at in terms of what messaging would help people change our behavior, our habits. I'm going to skip this too. There is a lot of lobbying and propaganda, by the way. The biggest oil companies spend about $200 million internationally to prevent efforts to disengage with fossil fuels. So there's a lot of money being spent to keep us in the dark or apathetic about this. Eco-psychology, in contrast, is a deeper perspective. It's more philosophical. It's more focused on our identity and our relationships. So I'm going to give you 3 main ideas that are coming out of this movement. One is personifying the planet again. There was a theory in the early 70s called the Gaia hypothesis, that the planet is a self-sustaining organism, that it's a biosystem, that it has regulatory systems, that it breathes, in effect. That's in quotation marks. So we need to do that again in order to have a relationship, because it's only in relationship that we change our behavior. If we objectify a person, this came out of a lot of the other talks, if we objectify an elder or an offender or an indigenous person or a neighbor, we tend not to listen to them, and that would be true of the earth. We also need to broadly define the self and community. Right now, what we have in psychology is a definition of the self that's isolated and individual. It's trapped inside your brain. That wasn't always the case. There are lots of cultures that define self as community or as everything. And then also I'll talk about facing monsters. That's about the storms and the climate change chaos that we're facing. So Personifying the Earth, this is another children's movie, and this is not to make light of the subject, but this is Moana facing Te Fiti, who is a Polynesian goddess, the goddess of the earth. The whole film, and by the way, it was so fascinating because I'd come up with these ideas a couple years before this film came out, and then I was like, well, they just illustrated the whole thing. So I'm going to use Moana from here on out, and I only have about a minute to go. But we need to personify the earth. We need to bring back some conception of this is our mother, this is our grandmother, this is our source. Native American, indigenous cultures have a tremendous tradition around this. The literature on it, the impassioned statements about I wouldn't cut my mother's hair, I wouldn't mow down all the wheat because that's my mother's hair. There are really moving statements around that. Okay, redefining self and community. This is Hillman again. If the self were defined as the interiorization of community, not a separate source or force or spark, but the process of interiorizing everyone around us and everything around us. He's saying others would not just include other people, because community is something more ecological, or at least animistic, a psychic field. So if I'm not in a field with others, if I'm not here in the room with all of you, then I am not. That's profound, and it's hard for us to imagine it. Okay, one word on facing monsters. The storms are terrifying. The storms are overwhelming. This is the largest tornado we've ever faced. This is the firestorm in California, yes. So the film, Moana, personifies this as this monster. And what Moana, the character, realizes is, this is actually Te Fiti herself. This is the goddess angry at us. She is destroying the planet because we stole her heart. This is the metaphor in the film. She has this stone, it's the heart of Te Fiti, and she has to return it. And in doing so, she has to face this monster, and she has to realize that the monster is the planet. So it's about a relationship with someone who's been traumatized. And so, again, reconciliation would involve contrition, compassion, courage, because I think what's happening right now is we're terrified. I think we're absolutely overwhelmed. So the idea here is, in healing the planet, we would heal ourselves, our relationships, our communities, and we'd have a chance to survive this mess that we've put ourselves in. Thank you.
Let's have a round of applause again for all of our panelists. And just in case anybody heard the slight disruption, let me say, my phone is actually, there's no ringer on, but apparently the timers don't care, and they make their own noise. So I apologize if you heard that disruption. And then I also want to put John and Scott on notice. I think you have another potential moderator in the making here. Did you see how he brought everything together? So
I'm a family therapist.
just putting you on notice. I'm not going to go through all of my normal summary because Scott did some of that, and that's good. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that stood out across the talks to me. And you actually had the best bring it all together line that there will be tonight. I wanted to add to that some of the things that came up was about how do we bring humanity to bear when we're dealing with each other, and how do we let emotions not override a situation, but be a part of how do we sort through getting to the next place, and how do we switch from victimhood to resiliency. Also, the ability to consider the impact of our actions or inactions on each other, and how are we conscious about what does that mean, and how do we give voice. So even if you look at the different discussions, that there's importance in giving voice to the various entities that are involved in a situation or may be in something that's not as healthy as we would like. And the importance of tolerance. I mean, we saw the examples of lack of tolerance, and I'm going to have to talk to Bill. I'm used to being an outlier, but in his whole study about people just move, I haven't moved, so something must be wrong with me, right? I'm not with like-minded people, and I'm doing okay. So I want to talk a little bit more about that study. Maybe I'm not really doing okay, and I think I am. But also, how do our priorities and perspectives allow us to come to a common understanding and then move forward towards healing? And that's important to keep in mind. And then finally, two other big things that came across is the importance of reestablishing a relationship with each other and with the natural world. That reconciliation always has to be at the heart of everything. And then what are the obligations that we have to each other? And how do we come to understand the multiple levels of healing that happen at the individual, the group, the communal, and the planetary level? And that we be attentive to each of those areas and realize that there is no silver bullet, and we have to be present in all those spaces. So I'm going to see if the panel has any quick reactions to each other, and then hand off to John to take questions from the floor.
It's almost like Quaker meeting. Don't you love it? I mean, let's just wait. Just one quick question, and then raise your hands. But the one thing that I didn't hear I heard it, but I didn't hear it, and I want to challenge the entire panel about this, is I hear unbelievable amounts of hard work in everything that you've laid out tonight. It's hard to reconcile. It's hard to be restorative. It's hard to overcome difference. It's hard to do the healing work. And it's hard to heal the planet. And I mean that, so we see a relative balancing of a desire to be safe, but a desire to be safe that has with it unbelievable hard work in the face of risk. So anybody want to take up the kind of safety and risk on the one side, or the whole notion of hard work?
I do have a thought. We are in a culture that encourages consumption and comfort and in some ways isolation, and I agree. The discomfort that's required for a lot of this dialogue is not really mainstream. It's not really part of mainstream discourse. So I do think we're overcoming a lot of inertia, a lot of polarization, and a lot of numbing, actually. There's a psychologist that says one of the symptoms of our time is anesthesia, that we don't perceive, we don't feel as much as we did.
Other
yeah.
comments about the hard work before I look for hands? Any other? Anybody want to take that on? Okay, Heather.
On yet? Yeah. I'd like to actually talk about what I talked about as not so hard, actually.
Okay.
And related to what Scott was saying about our relationship to the planet. So when I'm talking about reconciliation with Indigenous people, I did talk a lot about criticisms of the ways in which I think people have avoided and see that reconciliation with Indigenous people as yet another monster that doesn't want to be faced. But in fact, just the simple fact of thinking about where you live, you know, the land you're on, and a lot of the things that Scott talked about are maybe in the past of Europeans, but are not in the past of Indigenous people. They have maintained those relationships. And so you can take a few minutes every morning and kind of just be thankful, you know, which is a basic principle of, you know, the people whose land you're living on here, the Anishinaabe people. They have kind of guiding principles, guiding teachings, and being thankful, being honest, being truthful. You know, these are some of those principles. You know, there's a lot to learn, and while those are primarily intended for the Anishinaabe people, we all can actually learn how to live in this land in the way that people have learned, have always lived in a harmonious way with the planet. So I see a lot of connection there, and actually there are little steps that are easy to take, you know, even though when you look at the whole big monster and you challenge the fact that we benefit so much as settler colonial people from the oil industry and all the things we don't want to give up, you know, if we kind of set aside looking at giving everything up and think about the little daily small things that you can do, it can eventually grow into something that is fundamental change.
Okay, the floor is open. Please do. Oh, I'm coming.
Thank you. My question has to do with the meaningless growth that you just talked about.
Okay.
If you could just talk a little further on what you mean by meaningless growth and how is that represented globally and in individual countries as well?
Sure. It was a study done, sponsored by the UN. The lead author was from the Philippines, and they were looking at the human impact, mainly, not the ecological impact, but the human impact of globalization and deforestation, economic growth. I can back up to that slide. Okay. So they tried to boil down the problems with this process to 5 and then a core 6th word. So jobless growth that does not actually lead to more people being employed, ruthless growth that ignores the local impact on people and the environment, voiceless in the sense that it's not democratic and doesn't include local voices or indigenous voices. Rootless in the sense that it ignores local tradition and culture. Futureless in the sense that none of this is sustainable because it's all coming at the cost of environmental balance and life. And so they boiled all that down to one word, and they described this whole process of massive globalization and industrialization and deforestation as meaningless, because why are we doing it? All it's doing is generating wealth for a very small group of people. It's not helping the planet, it's not helping the people, so why are we doing it? And that report's been out there for 25 years now.
Okay, please raise your hands. Oh, back here.
It's an amazing panel. I'm commenting as an ancient historian. I work in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, but it's an amazing model, this that we have indigenous people who personify the planet, and they didn't ruin the planet, and that's a model. I don't have any way to evaluate it, but the ancient world is full of examples of people destroying the civilizations that they built up, right? I think Jared Diamond has a book all about these disasters, and when you look at the Mediterranean, you look at islands, since people could get in a boat and go there, they've been going there, and the species are all gone that were there when they went. So I'm just a little bit skeptical about how this argument goes that there's something in our nature to personify the planet and thus respect it. And if we can just get people to go back to that, it seems like maybe just personifying other people is the closer achievement, and maybe even more important achievement in the age of technology we're living in. So just wanted to pose that. Really, I didn't hear Heather, I came late, but to you, Scott, and Heather, both.
Yeah, I would say they go hand in hand. I would say the narrative that I'm talking about includes what's sometimes called prehistory, pre-flood, pre-cataclysmic event about 12,000 years ago. There is evidence of high civilization or hunter-gatherer civilization, but I would say the process of disconnecting from place and disconnecting from each other has accelerated over time. That's really the main point, is that our disconnection is now greater than it's been, even though we have the illusion of interconnectivity. I would say that's more virtual than personal. And I agree with you 100%. I think the challenge here is to not objectify any one of our relationships, because that's when it becomes deadly.
Raise your hands, please. Oh, I'm coming.
I have another question for Scott. Have you considered a fifth alternative to your four, that we could bioengineer our way into a new species, some quasi-cyborg thing, maybe not for the mass of the population, but there'd be enough people that could live without the Earth, basically?
That is one of the fantasies. That is one of the narratives. I'm not as positive about that one, because I think we lose this human connection that everyone has been speaking to. I think we lose emotion, human connection, empathy, compassion. That's my concern. In terms of viability, sure. Yeah, I'm just concerned about what we lose. Yeah.
The average hunter-gatherer, if they could see what was going to happen if they went to an agricultural society, probably wouldn't want to go there.
Yeah.
But that's where their descendants ended up.
Okay, other questions? Yes?
Okay, I have a jillion thoughts, so I'm going to try to tie them down to, less than 20 minutes. So I find it ironic that Heather started out with the affirmation of the land that we came from. And then, we moved on to Scott's presentation. We started with agriculture. So long hunting and gathering, where we lived in great peace and harmony with each other in a very egalitarian thing. Once we have agrarian societies, we've got to have, walled complexes and hoard the wealth in silos. And I think it's kind of gone downhill from there. Hoarding the wealth has been part of the stress of isolation. We have to, how much of our lives do we spend locking up our purse and locking up our car and locking up our closet, locking up the doors and the garage and so on, and then leaving the bag behind and whatever. So as a result, the European Americans, or maybe the privileged classes, are living in isolation. And so they retreat to their individual homes as if that's going to be safe once they can lock the door. But then they fear the differences, and they're peeking through their curtains about these suspicious people walking through the neighborhood, and so I have to call the cops because they have melanin in their skin. Oh my gosh. You know, they couldn't possibly be teenagers cutting a shortcut home from school. So that's kind of insane. One bit of hope is I often think about what would happen if the planet drifted into a coronal mass ejection and took out all the computers. Because then the homeless people and the indigenous people would get along just fine because they know how to eat the black walnuts and the dandelion greens, and they know how to get the squirrels and the doves and whatever. And once they close Kroger's, I'm done. So, except they do know some homeless people, so maybe that's okay. And then the huge disparity of wealth, where the privileged classes are storing their stuff like crazy. The corporations are encouraging them to get one more thing every time they walk through a store or see an ad, oh yeah, let's get that. I get some endorphins just thinking of how now I can own that shoe jaw, except you get it home and then like, why did I buy that thing? It's kind of stupid. So, like one of my white friends told us about how she has to spend $50 to somebody to complete a craft project from when her grandson was born, because she's always been too busy building a relationship with him. And so, but she does want to finish that quilt project. So that's the value of things. So maybe we have to be forced into living simply, and maybe we have to try to generate a concept of enough. Like maybe I don't need a 4-bedroom home when I'm, the kids are grown and gone. And the other source of hope for me is the huge Kaiser Permanente medical research survey that showed 87% of Americans at every demographic experienced childhood trauma and the effects of that, where the brain only gets as far as the amygdala and then you're fight, flight, and freeze 24/7, cortisol, adrenaline running through your system and messing with your personal health. And fortunately, the Michigan Association of Health Plans has created the Michigan ACEs project, Adverse Childhood Experience, and so there are 75 master trainers who'll go around and teach people how to offer resilience factors, and that can turn all these survivors of domestic violence and parents' divorce and poverty and racism and somebody in the family with disabilities or somebody who went to jail or all these different specific kinds of trauma, not to mention child sexual abuse, and how to present resilient factors so that, like Oprah, they're not just survivors, they're thrivers. And anybody can do this, so we are not stuck in our current reality. We can entertain other options to make life better for each of us and for all of us. So I invite you to say anything about any of that hits your heart.
Comments? Someone want to go there?
That was all well said. I don't know how I would respond to it.
Anyone? Hands, please, to raise them. Yes.
I guess I'm curious, as a boomer that will be dead soon, I wonder what you see as far as students, the new generations coming. I don't have much interaction with them. Are they hopeful? Are they hopeless? Are they eager to take on? Are they...
There's some in the room.
Well, I would love you to give me your take. Do you think we're totally screwed? I mean, or is there hope?
Okay, I'm bringing the microphone to whoever wants to answer. Here we go.
Hi, so first of all, thank you all. Really moving presentations, and you guys are all clearly very engaged with your work. I'm an environmental studies student, which is probably one of the most depressing majors to have at this time. And I think a lot about some of the different components that you guys have talked about. And I suppose, speaking kind of to what Scott was saying, I've heard the idea of community autonomy explored through like fictional books, Walden 2 by B.F. Skinner, Utopia by Thomas More. And it's a great idea, but I've grown up in a time where the psychology behind capitalism has just been so internalized. Our value is defined by the work that we're contributing to the society. If we are not active and engaged, then what are we even doing here? And from a technological side, you can have an exact follower. You know, you can have a metric attached to what your worth is, how many likes you get, how many more followers somebody else has compared to you. And we're growing up in this time where Scott was kind of speaking to this illusion of connection, where I read an article the other day even that was saying personal interaction, and I'm sure Clare can even kind of speak to that, the decline in personal care workers. Personal interaction is becoming a rare commodity, if that we can swap out with screens. So to kind of redirect the attention back to the much more educated people in the room, I'm wondering if any of you can speak at all, maybe William, about if your research has ever touched on technology's role in maintaining relationships, or how this constant audience of anyone, realistically, can affect us, or even Scott about kind of capitalism being, or the psychology behind that individualism versus community autonomy, or maybe even Heather about what has been done in the past, or what are these roots, how has this been enacted that we can come back to. I mean, I love the idea of looking in the past for answers, because, you know, this allegation of things being better than, and this place that we need to return to. But I'm growing up in a time where we are only moving forward, and I mean, I, for the life of me, couldn't imagine, you know, not being on Instagram at this age, or not having some type of presence established. And it's not that I can't exactly just walk away from the dominant economic system and what I've grown up with. Just some thoughts for you all.
Before our panelists go, I have to say, especially in a session on healing, I appreciate that you wanted to turn it back to the panelists. Everyone in this room has value. And your statement about to return it to the more educated people, I know what you were getting at, but you were so eloquent. And the question was to students. And if we are going to heal ourselves, we're going to heal a community, we're going to heal a planet, we have to recognize the value in every person. And so if the panelists can certainly chime in on your question, I also want to make sure if there are other students who had comments that they speak up. And I don't ever want you to discount yourself or what you bring to the table. Someone else is willing to do that for you. Don't you do it yourself.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
We'll take a few more comments out here, then we'll turn it back to the panel.
Hi. I guess the one question that I was sitting with after listening to all of this is what can we do personally? Because a lot of these things resonate really well with me, especially. I've tried to disconnect from social media, and that's left me feeling more disconnected and honestly a lot more depressed than ever, because like there aren't those people there, and how else do I connect with them? Because a lot of people, they don't initiate relationships. You have to do it for them, and that feels really, really lonely. And then going off of all the things that you've mentioned in your question, and the reason that I was going to ask what I can do is because I feel like oftentimes, I feel like oftentimes I can't do anything, and no one's going to listen to me. And I get the reason we vote is because the collective voice is important, and it can make a difference. But I rarely, if ever, feel listened to, and I feel like our generation, like we're just continually being shut out or placated by likes on Instagram or new things that we can buy. And I've tried to live that simple life that someone in the audience was speaking of, and it really hasn't left me feeling any happier. Honestly, I've lost friends over it, and like you're just so disconnected. What else? So yeah, I guess if we will turn it back to the panelists, I guess my question is, how can we solve some of these issues that you've posed specifically, Scott, and in terms of relationships with Dr. Chopik? Funnily enough, I had your class, I'm
so sorry.
No, it was a class I enjoyed.
Other comments back here? Comments? Okay.
Hey, thank you very much. It was very interesting to listen to all of your talks. And just one sentence of yours that I'm from Germany. That's probably you hear it from my accent. I'm a research scholar here, so don't wonder about this. I just wanted to mention that I'm doing research about a concept that is called outcome efficacy. And I think this is something that we really have to look at, like that people really believe that their tiny actions can have a big impact. Because when I started to eat vegetarian, and I sorry, I had these discussions with other people, and they always said like, but why does that matter? Why does it matter when I stop eating meat? Or why does it matter when I don't buy food with packaging anymore? Like, and I think that we all have to kind of realize that everything we do matters, because it, in the end, it like, yeah, all the actions together matter. And even if I behave in a certain way, others will see how I behave, and that will also impact their behavior. So I think this is something that every one of us could do.
Did you want to respond to her in any way?
I just wanted to say there is a book called Surplus Powerlessness by Michael Lerner that really addresses what you're saying, that people have a lot more power over even politics than they realize, and that we generally disenfranchise ourselves before the system does.
My name is Roberta Stanley. I'm a proud graduate of Michigan State University, and I want to thank you for this rich session. Now, I am currently one of those people you somewhat disparaged up there. I'm a lobbyist, but I lobby on behalf of K-12 public education, child nutrition, school health, and equity. And I have a theory in life and my work, and I've learned this working on Capitol Hill and for the state. I have a policy I follow: sensitivity and awareness. And I think that's what you brought out tonight, and I think it serves us very well. Thank you.
So let me turn it back to the panel. We've had a variety of different voices, different points being put forward. Anybody want to rise to any number of them on the panel?
I do have a talk on technology and social media and the impact on identity, relationships, memory, attention, learning, empathy, compassion. It takes a long time though, so I can't summarize it all. But I would say what you described in terms of the initial isolation when you unplug from all of that is real. And when I give this talk, I usually try to land on lots of tips at the end. One of them is don't try to unplug alone, or you will be alone. You have to do it as a group, and you have to recruit people before you do it, because people are plugged in. And there is literal addiction to technology. There is physiological addiction. It's designed to be addictive. They're using psychological operant behavioral conditioning, lots of scientific information that programmers are using to get us more hooked. If you want to read about it, there's a book by Adam Alter called Irresistible, and it's all about how we're deliberately being hooked. So when you go against that current, you will at first literally be alone unless you recruit at least a couple of other people to do it with you. Because that is where everybody's living their life, more or less. Younger people especially, but even older people can get addicted, can get hooked. So the challenge here is to use it as a tool. You can't throw out your phone, but to use it as a tool, and then the activity, the connection, the dialogue has to be face-to-face. Because we lose a lot, even in terms of brain development, we lose a lot of right hemisphere development when we're not talking to each other like this, when we're not looking at each other. If kids don't have face-to-face contact, if they don't have time to play with each other, imaginative play, not just video game play, then parts of the brain don't develop at the same pace. So it's very hard to do this, but if you do it, even as you were saying, any little action matters, but don't do it absolutely alone.
I see that Clare wants in, and other people were going to, I thought I saw a reaction from a couple.
Yeah, I would like to thank the panelists as well. This has been so thought-provoking, I hardly know where to begin. I have a lot of different comments. I want to say about, you're trying to disconnect. We're trying to get some older adults connected, because there's a lot of great work on technology, how it's assisting older adults be in communication where they haven't been able to be before. You know, Facebook has been huge in terms of connecting them to family members that live at a distance and they may never see again, and grandchildren. And so there are a lot of wonderful things happening with technology and older adults right now, a lot of good research happening right at MSU on how important technology can be with telemedicine. You know, in rural areas, for example, where there are no psychiatrists, are no psychologists who can help people. And so the use of technology for really healthy things is happening too. I want to comment on your statement about not knowing what's going on with the other generations. I think we're so disconnected to across generations, right? And Cynthia mentioned that I'm the director of Age Alive. It's a new initiative on campus to try to bring people together around aging. And what we mean by aging is aging through the lifespan. So wherever you happen to be in your aging journey, whether you're young or old, you know, we need to get connected with each other and learn from each other. The young can learn from the old can learn from the young. So I hope you get involved in that organization in one way or another, and I have brochures and I have sign-up sheets and all that good stuff here. I think what everybody's saying is this need to be connected, right, to Mother Earth or to each other or to different generations, and that's what it seems to boil down to, and in positive ways, and people that are different from ourselves in some ways, not just be a homogenous group. So there's a lot more I could say because there's been so many thoughtful comments tonight, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Other members of the panel? Bill, you look like you're about to jump,
Sure.
perhaps, or Mary?
Yeah, so I had a lot of thoughts, and those were some really great comments. So yeah, I partially study sort of lifespan relationships, and I've done some work with technology, as you alluded to, and how for a lot of people, you know, social networks serve as this outlet that they've never had before. So yeah, so you've grown up in this really special time in human history where it's all that you know. Yeah, congratulations. It's sort of the only thing that you've known. But you know, for baby boomers, they've sort of come late to it, and you know, they might reap more benefits that, you know, maybe it's sort of lost on us. But yeah, I mean, I'm of a certain age where I also feel sort of the generational listlessness sometime, where you know, there's a lot of problems going on, and you know, it's unclear how like the actions of, you know, one person can really ripple and, you know, affect broader change. But I think, yeah, like acting as though you make a difference because you do is sort of a good, you know, impetus to go on. But yeah, I think one really great sign is that this younger generation is more critical of a lot of things that previous generations weren't. So, you know, there's some civic rights that your generation will have to be champions for that have never existed in human history. So, you know, something like the right of marriage, or sort of, you know, reconnecting to previous generations, you know, healing the earth. It's literally the problem you have to solve, because if you don't, it's sort of the existential thing that if you don't solve it, it solves you. But in a way, it's sort of hard to get people inspired to do things like that. You know, it's really easy to hear a lot of this doom and gloom and get, you know, really down on yourself. But in reality, your generation is really equipped to tackle more problems that previous generations weren't. You can mobilize faster than any generation in history. You're more socially conscious than any generation in history. You have a broader grasp of how groups work, how groupthink works, how bias works, how political parties work, how special interest works, how special interest can pollute, all sorts of areas of, you know, all of these were sort of blissfully ignorant for every other generation. So if I can instill any sort of hope, you are our only hope, and thank God, because you are the only people who have the skills to tackle it. No pressure. That's right.
Mary or
And the
Heather?
willingness to do so.
That's right. Yeah, you give a crap to do it.
Right. And it's very evident from the commentary that we've heard this evening. I just want to touch very briefly on another facet of what we've spoken about, the reconciliation and the healing and the engagement. I teach a negotiation course at the law school, and it's really designed to enhance the human connectivity and the human communication that exists between individuals. And one of the things that I put out in the space where my students are located is this notion of active listening. Very few of us really listen well. We think we do, but we really don't. Why don't we listen well? Because we're so eager to think about how we're going to respond to whatever it is that we're hearing, that we're not hearing what we're supposed to be hearing. And so there's no validation of the human thought that is ultimately expressed. And so people just tend to chime out. And so I think, if we just have an awareness, I mean, part of what we've been talking about is being aware of some of the issues, because that goes a long way toward understanding and grappling with them. We don't have all the answers, and I certainly don't have all the answers for my law students, but what I tell them is if you're aware of the fact that you're in this conversation and you shouldn't be thinking about what your response is, you should be thinking about whether you're really hearing and playing back to the individual in a way that honors what they've expressed and the emotion that has been attached to what they've expressed. That goes a long way toward building relationships.
Heather?
A couple of things. Is this on? Yeah. A couple of things I was thinking of. You mentioned this kind of dissatisfaction with things that you've tried, in terms of disconnecting, and I really appreciate the panel's comments on the emphasis on connecting and reconnection with other actual living beings and people and other beings, of course. And if I can go back again to thinking about living in this land, the land of the Anishinaabeg, another important principle is to act for seven generations into the future. Not so the action, you may not feel the repercussion of your action immediately, but you're thinking about how that action may impact generations to come. And that is something that's not strictly an indigenous principle or anything. You can kind of think about many philosophies which provide that kind of thinking. And then I had another thought, but I just lost it, I think. So there was, what's that? Spoon method, what's that?
Only the person who has the spoon can speak.
Oh, actually, that's exactly it. So another understanding of communication from an Anishinaabe and other indigenous people, I'm sure you've heard kind of stereotypically the idea of the talking circle. Well, I actually use that principle in my class to do exactly what you're saying, so that students are not just thinking about their own individual answer to kind of question back and forth between me and individual students, but rather we go around in a circle in the class, and each person has to really listen to what all has been said before them, and they're formulating their participation in the conversation based on what other people have said, and not just formulating my own individual answer. And so there's that kind of I think focus on individualism that we're all, pretty kind of, it's just subconscious that we may need to be more conscious about how we are part of a collective and how we connect to other people in meaningful ways, but not through appropriating other people's cultures, but through learning from the basic principles that underlie them and finding them in yourselves and your actions.
I'm going to just add two quick things and then turn it back over to Cynthia and invite you all up to talk to the panelists individually if you want to. One thing, my wife and I have both worked in Africa for about the last 20 years, and one thing that I have walked away with from that is the term Ubuntu, which I take to understand from my friends in Africa that it is that I am because you are, and you are because I am, which means that it's impossible to disassociate. In effect, it's the idea of atomistically saying that you matter and others do not, and that you can actually have perfect value of yourself, which I think goes against a lot of what we heard on this panel tonight. Ubuntu is, I think, what many of you are talking about. Last but not least, one of our friends from Ann Arbor, yes, long ago, one of our friends from Ann Arbor did a study of cooperatives, and she found that the most important thing about cooperatives that existed in Ann Arbor is people had as a fundamental value a desire to live their vision of the future today and not to wait. That it really was a desire to make sure that they put down something that mattered. And I think we've heard that very much across the panel. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it back to Cynthia, and she'll take us out.
Great, thank you, John. I also want to point out into the question of what can we collectively do, and I know you asked it as students, but what can we collectively do, is we can remember history. Right? And not history for the sake of history, but what are the lessons from history? You know, what are the movements and how did they come about? What was successful about them and why? What didn't work and why? So that they can be used to inform how we approach emerging situations, and also to remember what everyone is bringing to the table, and not think that the solution that one community took is the solution for everybody. Right? There are lots of examples that we heard tonight that there are caveats where you could carve out populations and say, well, that's not really true for, right? And we have to remember that the carving out is for the benefit of not pointing out the difference and othering, but using that voice and that perspective to get to a common solution that will let us have that better place today. The panelists will be here for about another 15 minutes or so, and so we encourage you to come up if you have individual questions. I always have to thank from the bottom of my heart our repeat attenders. I appreciate every time that I see you. You may not think that I notice you, but I do, and it means a lot that this has value enough for you to take time out of your evening to come and be a part of us. We will be back in the fall. You noticed this year that we did a little variation with moderators, and we may continue to do that, but we will always ensure that we have an excellent panel for you and engaging conversation. And so with that, I thank you. I sign off to everyone listening on live stream, and thank you for your time tonight.